The screen is pitch black. A single flickering candle flame pulls back to reveal a sheet of yellowed, brittle parchment. The handwriting is elegant loopy, cursive written with a steady hand. But the words it forms are a cold-blooded horror. To be sold, a likely Negro woman, aged approximately 22 years. Remarkable for her strength and industry. Currently with child, sound of mind and limb. To be auctioned to the highest bidder on the steps of the courthouse this Tuesday. In any other context, a pregnant woman is a symbol of life, of a future, of a family beginning. But in the mid-1800s, in the shadow of the American South, that bulge beneath her apron was not a person. It was a line item. It was an accrual of interest. It was a dividend. For this woman whose name has been scrubbed from the earth, as if by a wire. Brush pregnancy did not grant her a reprieve from the auction block. It was the very reason she was there. A pregnant woman was a 2-for-1 investment. She was labor for today and capital for tomorrow. We are told that history is a record of what happened, but that is a lie. History is often a record of what survived the fire, and for the enslaved, the only things that survived were the receipts. We don't have her diary. We don't have her prayers. We have her price. Through the meticulous digging of modern historians, a haunting pattern began to emerge from the dust of old plantation ledgers across the Deep South. A woman appears in a bill of sale in Virginia, pregnant. 2 years later, a woman of the same description appears in a probate record in South Carolina, with a toddler and a new infant. 3 years after that, she is sold again in Georgia, listed as heavy with child. She was sold while pregnant, again and again. She was moved like a piece of heavy machinery from one master to another, forced to give birth across 5 different plantations, in 5 different counties, perhaps even different states. Each time she felt the first flutter of life in her womb, she knew it wasn't a gift. It was a countdown to her next sale. Who was she? To her masters, she was property now, 42, or simply the wench. To her children, she was a warmth that was snatched away before they could even memorize the shape of her face. To us, she is a ghost in the machine of American capitalism. We are going to do something that the men who owned her never intended for us to do. We are going to look past the ink and the dollar signs. We are going to reconstruct a life from the fragments of her exploitation. This is not a story of a life remembered. It is a story of a life recovered from the silence. Prepare yourself, because the deeper we go into these ledgers, the darker the truth becomes. The records were never meant to tell her story, they were meant to track a commodity. But in their greed, the slaveholders left behind a trail of breadcrumbs that lead directly to the woman history tried to erase. To understand the life of the woman in the ledger, we have to understand the ground she walked on, a world where the law was not a shield, but a cage. In the American South, enslavement was not a temporary sentence for a crime committed. It was a biological inheritance. It was a condition carried in the blood, passed down from mother to child, with the same inevitability as the color of one's eyes. By the time this woman was born, the peculiar institution had perfected a terrifying legal doctrine, partus sequitur. In Latin, it translates to "the offspring follows the womb." It was a simple, forward sentence that changed the course of human history. It meant that the status of a child, whether they were born free or as a piece of property, was determined solely by the status of the mother. This was a calculated departure from traditional English common law, which usually tracked lineage through the father. But in the colonies, the fathers were often the masters themselves. By decreeing that the child follows the womb, the system turned the enslaved woman's reproductive system into a mint. Every pregnancy was a literal expansion of the master's portfolio. If a woman gave birth to 10 children, she hadn't just produced labor, she had increased the master's net worth tenfold without him having to spend a single cent at an auction block. This turned the enslaved woman into the most valuable asset in the entire Atlantic economy. She was reproductive capital, while an enslaved man's value was tied to his physical strength and the work his hands could perform between sunrise and sunset. A woman's value was dual. She was expected to work the fields or the big house with the same intensity as any man. But her surplus value lay in her ability to manufacture new workers. Think of the psychological weight of that reality. For her, the most intimate, sacred moments of womanhood were weaponized against her. To feel a child move inside her was to feel the growth of her master's wealth. To nurse a child was to prepare a product for market. In the eyes of the law, she wasn't a mother. She was a vessel. The system incentivized her constant resale, especially when she was pregnant. To a plantation owner, in the exhausted soils of the Upper South places, like Virginia or Maryland, selling a pregnant woman to the booming cotton frontier of the Deep South was the ultimate exit strategy for a debt. He wasn't just selling one person. He was selling a future. He could demand a premium price because the buyer was getting a guaranteed return on investment. This is why her name disappears while her condition remains highlighted in red ink. In the cold language of property law, she was treated no differently than a prize heifer or a breeding mare. If she was sound, it meant her reproductive organs were functional. If she was prolific, it was a rave review that would drive her price into the thousands of dollars. For the men who traded her, there was no moral conflict. They didn't see a woman terrified of what would happen to the life inside her. They saw a self-replicating labor force. They saw a way to settle a gambling debt or provide a dowry for a daughter. While enslaved men faced the constant threat of being sold down the river for rebellion or age, the enslaved woman lived in a state of perpetual vulnerability. Her very fertility, the one thing that should have been her own, was the reason she was never safe, never settled, and never allowed to take root. The more children she could bear, the more likely she was to be sold, because her inventory was too valuable to keep in one place. She lived at the intersection of two brutal systems: the violence of forced labor and the cold precision of property law. To the men who signed the deeds, she was a ghost, even while she was breathing. She was a walking bank account. And as we trace her movement through the records, we see that the system didn't just ignore her humanity, it relied on the systematic destruction of it to keep the wheels of the economy turning. Every time she was sold, the law affirmed that she owned nothing, not even the heartbeat beneath her ribs. She was an inheritance passed from father to son, a line item in a will, a pawn in a game of global trade. And the most haunting part, this wasn't a breakdown of the system. This was the system working exactly as it was designed to. The light in the cabin is thin, filtered through the cracks in the rough-hewn logs. We can imagine her here, in the late 1830s, somewhere in the rolling hills of Virginia. She is perhaps 19 or 20. Her body is changing, the skin of her abdomen tightening, a sensation both miraculous and terrifying. In any other world, this would be her introduction to womanhood. In this world, it is her introduction to the ledger. She likely grew up in the Upper South, a region where the soil was tired from a century of tobacco farming. The great planters were land poor. They had thousands of acres and hundreds of people, but very little cash. Their wealth was tied up in the bodies of the enslaved. To keep their estates afloat, they began to harvest a different kind of crop: children. This was the Virginia Pipeline, the beginning of a domestic slave trade that would move 1 million souls into the dark heart of the Deep South. Her first pregnancy was the moment she became liquid. Before this, she was just another hand in the field. Now, she was an appreciating asset. We do not know the name of the father. In the archives, he is a shadow. Perhaps he was a young man from a neighboring farm, someone she stole moments with in the brush after the horn blew for rest. Or, more likely, given the mechanics of the trade, he was a man chosen for his size and strength, a forced pairing orchestrated by a master looking to breed a certain type of worker. There were no doctors for her, no midwives of her choosing who knew her mother or her grandmother. Instead, her pregnancy was monitored with the same clinical detachment one might give a thoroughbred horse. Her belly was measured not for the health of the child, but for the estimation of its eventual market value. The surveillance was constant. She was watched to ensure she didn't work too hard to cause a miscarriage, yet worked hard enough to earn her keep. The cruelty was balanced by a sickening sense of stewardship. When the labor pains finally came, she was likely in a dirt floor shack, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and sweat. There was no celebration. When that first cry pierced the night, it wasn't the sound of a new life beginning a legacy. It was the sound of a new serial number being generated. Within days, that child was registered not in a family Bible, but in an inventory list. One infant, male, unnamed, property of the estate. In those first weeks of nursing, as she held that child to her breast, The realization must have settled into her bones like a cold winter rain. This child did not belong to her. She was merely the warehouse where the master kept his goods until they were ready for use. She saw the way the older women looked at her with a mixture of pity and a hardened, jagged kind of strength. They knew what she was just learning. Pregnancy didn't offer protection from the whip or the heavy labor of the harvest. It only ensured that you were worth too much to kill, but never enough to be respected. The pattern was set. She had proven she was fruitful. And in the economy of the South, a fruitful woman was a woman who could be moved. The moment the child was weaned, or perhaps even before the rumors started, men in tall hats, carrying leather-bound books and riding fine horses, began to visit the plantation. They didn't look at the tobacco. They looked at her. They looked at her teeth, the width of her hips, and the health of the toddler clinging to her skirts. She would have seen the chains in the back of their wagons. She would have heard the clinking of the irons. This was the moment the pipeline opened up to swallow her. Her first child was a proof of concept. The master now knew he had a breeder. And because he needed cash to pay off a London merchant, or to buy more land in the new territories of Mississippi, he decided to realize his gains. She was told to pack her things, which amounted to nothing more than the clothes on her back, and perhaps a scrap of cloth. She was separated from whatever community she had managed to build in those 20 years. Her mother, her siblings, the father of her child, they were erased in a single signature on a bill of sale. But there was a complication, a bonus for the buyer. She was pregnant again. As she was marched toward the coffle, the long line of enslaved people chained together for the trek south, she carried 2 lives. The toddler walking beside her and the new life growing inside her. The walk would be hundreds of miles. The dust of the road would fill her lungs, and the heat would blister her skin. Every step she took away from her home was a step deeper into a system that saw her only as a biological machine. She wasn't just a woman walking into exile. She was a moving investment, carrying the interest of a future master. She was sold with a child inside her, a phrase that appears with sickening frequency in the archives of the American domestic slave trade. This was the beginning of her disappearance. This was the moment she stopped being a person with a history and started being a lot in a transcontinental auction. She had survived her first birth, only to find that her reward was to be sold into a more brutal wilderness. The realization must have been a crushing weight. Her womb, the source of life, was the very thing that was driving her into the mouth of the Deep South. Her body was the engine of her own displacement. The road ahead was long, and the plantations of the Black Belt were waiting. There, the labor would be harder, the sun hotter, and the records even colder. She was leaving Virginia behind. But she was carrying the system with her, tucked deep inside her body, where it would continue to feed on her for 4 more births, 4 more sales, and for more erasures. The road to the Deep South was not a road. It was a scar across the continent. Thousands of miles of red clay and dust, traveled by what historians call the coffle, a human chain gang, where men were neck-handed to one another and women walked behind, often carrying the very weight that made them so expensive. As she crossed the border into Georgia or Alabama, her body was a ticking clock. The traders who bought her in Virginia were speculators. They were the middlemen of human misery, buying low in the exhausted tobacco lands and selling high in the booming cotton kingdom. To them, her second pregnancy was a logistical challenge. If she gave birth on the trail, it delayed the march. If she lost the baby due to the grueling pace, their profit margin shrunk. She was likely forced to walk 20 miles a day. We have accounts of women in her position, women whose names we actually know, like Louisa Piquet, who described the agony of the long march. The swelling in the ankles, the searing pain in the lower back, the constant fear that the water would break in the middle of a creek crossing or a forest path. There was no maternity leave in the domestic slave trade. There was only the driver's whip and the demand to keep up. This is where the trauma of forced relocation meets the trauma of forced motherhood. In Virginia, she might have had a mother to guide her through the birth. She might have had a community of women who knew the herbs for the pain or the songs to soothe a newborn. But now, she was in a camp of strangers. She was surrounded by men who looked at her with either predatory eyes or the hollowed-out stare of the defeated. When she arrived at the second plantation, perhaps a sprawling raw estate hacked out of the Alabama wilderness. She was sold almost immediately. The New South was hungry for labor. The cotton gin had made short staple cotton a global gold mine, and the land was being cleared at a feverish pace. She was purchased by a man who didn't care about her history. He cared about her producibility. She gave birth to her second child in a place she did not know, under the gaze of a master she had never seen before. There was no recovery time. In the records of these frontier plantations, we see a chilling efficiency. A woman might be given 2 weeks to mend after a birth before she was sent back into the rows. The infant would be left in the nursery, usually a shack where an elderly, infirm enslaved woman would watch a dozen babies at once, feeding them pot liquor or cornmeal mush, while their mothers bled in the fields. But the master of the second plantation was likely a man of fluctuating fortunes. The cotton market was volatile. A panic in the banks of New York or London could send a shockwave through the South, causing creditors to call in their loans. When the debt collectors came knocking, the master didn't sell his land, he sold his movable property. And so, it happened again. She was listed in a newspaper advertisement. A choice lot of Negroes, including a prime woman, 24 years of age, with 2 children, and again pregnant. Think about the psychological fracture of this moment. She has just survived the march. She has just survived a second birth in a strange land. She is trying to keep her first 2 children alive in a place where she has no kin. And just as she begins to recognize the trees and the smells of this new prison, she is packed into a wagon. This time, she might have been sold to a soul driver, headed for the New Orleans market, the great slave mart of the South. The journey by river was different, but no less terrifying. Packed onto the lower decks of steamboats, she would have been surrounded by the coughs of the sick and the groans of the dying. The dampness of the river air would have chilled her to the bone by the time she reached berth number 3. She was likely in Louisiana or Mississippi. She was now a veteran of the trade. She knew the language of the auction block. She knew how to stand so the buyers wouldn't see the exhaustion in her eyes. She knew that every time she held a new baby, she was holding a hostage. The system of interplantation markets relied on the distress of women like her. They were the currency of the South. When a planter died, his estate was liquidated to be divided among his heirs. If he had 3 sons, and the woman had 3 children, the family might be split up so each son could have a start on his own farm. She was a witness to her own dismantling. Each pregnancy was a signal to the market that she was still viable, still productive. And each sale was a confirmation that she was not a person, but a walking annuity. She was being moved through the gears of a machine that never stopped grinding, a machine that viewed her heartbeat as a mere mechanical function of a grander economic engine. She was sold with a child inside her, because, to the buyer, that child was free money. It was interest on a loan. It was the increase that made the purchase worthwhile. And as she stepped off the boat in New Orleans, pregnant for the 3rd time, she was stepping into the most brutal labor regime the world had ever seen. The sugar and cotton fields of the Deep South were waiting for her, and they were hungry. The deeper we go into this story, the more her face fades and the ink takes over. We have to look at the ledgers, now the only place she truly exists in the eyes of the law. If you open a plantation journal from the 1840s, you won't find a section for family histories. You will find sections for livestock, tools, and inventory. In these books, she is reduced to a column of data. The plantation owner would sit at his mahogany desk and record his increase with the same clinical coldness. He used to record the number of bales of cotton harvested. Her identity was dissolved into 3 specific variables: age, reproductive status, and issue produced. This is how historians find her today. They don't look for a name like Sarah or Mary, because those names were often changed by new masters, or shared by a dozen other women on the same estate. Instead, they look for the pattern of births. They find a woman who appears in a probate record in 1842 with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. Then, they find a sale record in 1844 for a woman of the same age, now with a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a newborn. They track the issue. The children become the breadcrumbs that lead us back to the mother. By the time she reached her 3rd and 4th pregnancies, she was no longer a young woman in the eyes of the market. In her mid to late 20s, she was considered prime. This was the peak of her market value. She had proven her durability. She could survive the march. She could survive the birth, and she could survive the labor. But as her value to the master went up, her value to herself plummeted. Every birth was a new trauma. By birth number 3 and birth number 4, the system of separation became a routine. In the Deep South, there was a constant demand for young hands. A 6-year-old child was old enough to be a waiter in the big house, or a trash picker in the cotton rows. They were old enough to be sold. Imagine the atmosphere of those 3rd and 4th plantations. They were likely forced labor camps, designed for maximum output. Here, her identity was completely absorbed by the numbers. She was the breeder from Virginia. She was Han No. For the ledger followed her like a shadow. When she was sold for the 4th time, the bill of sale wouldn't mention her skill as a seamstress, or the way she could sing a child to sleep. It mentioned her fecundity. It listed her children as lots, Lot A, Lot B, Lot C. They were separated from her at the auction block, sold to different buyers to maximize the estate's profit. The system didn't want family continuity. It wanted liquid assets. Family was a liability. A mother who was attached to her children might run away. A mother who was unencumbered was easier to drive. She was being stripped of her humanity, layer by layer. First, her home was taken. Then, her name was lost in the ledgers. Then, her children were taken. By the time she was pregnant for the 5th time, she was a ghost inhabiting a body that was no longer hers. She was a biological machine that had been moved 4 times, across hundreds of miles, and through the hands of dozens of men who saw her as nothing more than a ledger entry. The historians call this the Archive of Silence. We know exactly how much she cost. We know exactly how many children she produced. We know the names of the men who bought her. But the ledger never records her grief. It never records the sound of her voice. It only records the issue. And as she prepares for her 5th birth, on yet another plantation, the records begin to tremble. The ink is running thin. We are approaching the moment where the system finally finishes with her, and where history lets her go. The economics of the 1850s Deep South were not built on cotton alone. They were built on the biological interest extracted from the bodies of women. In the grand houses of Mississippi and Louisiana, men spoke of breeding with the same casual, technical precision they used to discuss crop rotation or steam engine maintenance. There is a myth, long perpetuated by those who wish to sanitize history, that slave breeding was a rarity or a fringe practice. The records tell a different story. While formal breeding farms were less common than the propaganda of the time claimed, the logic of breeding was everywhere. It was in the tax codes, the insurance policies, and the daily management of the fields. For the woman in our ledger, her 5th pregnancy was not an accident of nature. It was a scheduled event. On many plantations, the reproductive cycles of women were mapped out alongside the agricultural calendar. If a woman failed to conceive within a certain window after her last birth, she was often subjected to forced pairings. Masters would choose an enslaved man based on his physical dimensions: broad shoulders, sturdy legs, and force him into the woman's cabin. This was not marriage. It was state-sanctioned, economically driven rape. But the cruelty didn't end with conception. The labor of a pregnant woman was a delicate calculation of greed. If she was pushed too hard in the cotton rows during her 3rd trimester, she might miscarry, costing the master a future hand worth hundreds of dollars. If she was allowed too much rest, the current harvest suffered. The compromise was often a system of task labor that ignored the physical reality of a late-term pregnancy. She was expected to pick a certain quota of cotton, even as her center of gravity shifted and her joints loosened under the weight of the child. If she fell behind, the driver, often an enslaved man himself, forced into the role of an overseer, would have to choose between the whip and the master's wrath. Medical care was a farce, while a veterinarian might be called for a sick horse. The doctoring of enslaved women was usually left to the mistress of the house or a Negro doctor with no formal training. Miscarriages, which were frequent due to malnutrition and physical trauma, were rarely recorded as human tragedies. In the ledgers, they appear as losses or damaged goods. If a woman had too many miscarriages, her resale value plummeted. She was labeled unsound or barren. A death sentence that often meant being sold to the most grueling labor camps where longevity wasn't expected. Why did she survive? Why did she make it to birth number 5? Because the system needed her alive. She was a high-value asset, a proven breeder. In the twisted logic of the South, her survival was a testament to her hardiness, a trait that made her even more attractive to buyers. Each successful birth was a stamp of quality on her pedigree. Asterisk, she was caught in a feedback loop of exploitation. The more she suffered through birth, the more valuable she became. The more valuable she became, the more likely she was to be sold. The more she was sold, the more she was forced to produce. Her womb was a factory that never closed, and the management was only interested in the output. By this point, her 5th pregnancy, the economics of forced motherhood had stripped her of everything but the most basic biological functions. She was a survivor, yes, but a survivor of a war that was being waged against her own anatomy. She lived because her death would have been a bad investment. Every time she felt the labor pains, she knew the routine. She knew the child would be registered. She knew the child would be appraised. And she knew that, eventually, the child would be a commodity used to pay for the very chains that held them both. She survived because the machine wasn't done with her yet. The cotton was still tall, the debts were still high, and the market for human souls was still brisk. The year is 1858. The ledger for a sprawling estate in the Mississippi Delta lies open. The ink is darker here, the entries more cramped, as if the sheer volume of property has outgrown the margins of the book. And there, near the bottom of a page dedicated to the home farm inventory, we find the final trace of her. One woman, Negro, aged approx 32. 5th child, born December 12th, condition, worn. Worn. It is a word used for a plowshare that has hit too many stones. It is a word for a garment that has been scrubbed thin on a washboard. In the cold, calculating eyes of the plantation overseer, she was no longer prime. The 5 births, the thousands of miles walked in the sun, the grief of 4 previous separations, had finally begun to settle into her frame. At 32 in age, we now consider the vibrant prime of life. She was biologically old, in the kingdom of cotton. This 5th birth is the emotional peak of her recorded existence because it represents the moment the system stops looking at her as a future and starts looking at her as a liability. The child, a girl, is listed beneath her name. For a few months, they exist together in the nursery records. We can imagine her in those quiet, stolen hours of the night, nursing this 5th child, perhaps wondering which neighbor, or which creditor would eventually claim this one. But then, something happens that is common in the archives of the enslaved. The records go silent. In the 1860 inventory for the same estate, the 5th child is there. She is listed as a small girl, age 2. But the mother, the woman who had been sold again and again, the woman whose womb had funded the expansion of 3 different family fortunes is gone. There is no sold notation next to her name. There is no died entry in the mortality schedule. She simply evaporates. In the world of the archive, silence is often a scream. There are several possibilities for what happened when history lost her. Perhaps she died in the aftermath of that 5th birth, her body finally refusing to mend after a decade of being treated like a machine. Perhaps she became disabled, a polite term in the ledgers for someone whose spirit or body had broken so completely they were no longer marketable. In those cases, the worn were often absorbed into the background of a large estate, relegated to the invalid cabins where they were given the barest rations until they passed away, unrecorded and unmourned. Or perhaps there is a darker, more bureaucratic reason for her disappearance. In the lead-up to the Civil War, as the tension over slavery reached a breaking point, many planters began to hide their assets to avoid taxes, or to shield property from potential lawsuits. She may have been moved in an unrecorded under-the-table trade, a ghost transaction between cousins that left no paper trail. Whatever the cause, the moment history loses her is a moment of profound, jagged injustice. She had given everything. She had given her labor, her blood, her children, and her very identity to build the economy of a nation. And yet, when she was no longer useful, the system that had tracked every penny of her value couldn't even be bothered to record her end. Her children remain, We see them scattered across the ledgers of Mississippi and Alabama like seeds thrown into a gale. We see a boy, aged 10 inches, being sold to a planter in Texas. We see a girl, aged 14 inches, being given as a wedding present to a niece in Tennessee. They carry her DNA, her features, and her trauma into the next generation. But they no longer carry her. She vanishes into the white space of the page. She becomes part of the great unnamed, one of the millions of women whose reproductive lives were the silent engine of American history. But even in her absence, the records betray the truth. The very fact that she disappeared while her assets, her children, remained, proves exactly what the system thought of her. She was the packaging. Once the product was delivered and the issue was harvested, the packaging was discarded. She had no monument. No headstone marks her resting place in the woods behind a plantation. That is now a suburban housing development or a soybean field. But the silence she left behind is loud. It is a vacuum that demands to be filled with the truth. We lose her in 1860, just as the world she knew was about to go up in flames. She didn't live to see the Emancipation Proclamation. She didn't live to search for her children and the information wanted. Columns of post-war newspapers. She disappeared into the dark. But the trail she left behind, the trail of 5 births and 5 sales, is a map of a crime that no ledger can ever truly hide. What happened to the children? This is the question that haunts the edges of every ledger, the ghost ache that follows the woman history tried to erase. If we look at the statistics of the 1850s, the fate of her 5 children was not a matter of chance. It was a matter of math. In the internal slave trade, roughly 1 in every 3 enslaved children was separated from their parents. By the time she disappeared from the records, the odds that all 5 of her children were on the same plantation or even in the same state were nearly 0. To the men who bought them, these children were increments of wealth. To their mother, they were pieces of her soul being torn off and sold to the highest bidder. We have to imagine the aftermath of those sales. When a child is sold away, the trauma doesn't end when the wagon disappears over the horizon. It embeds itself in the nervous system. It becomes a generational inheritance. Her first child, born in Virginia, was likely the first to be liquidated. By the time he was a teenager, he would have been a prime male, the most sought-after commodity in the New Orleans markets. He might have ended up on a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where the work was so brutal the life expectancy was less than 7 years. Or perhaps he was lucky, sold to a tradesman in a city like Mobile or Nashville, learning a craft while living in a state of perpetual, hollow loneliness. Her middle children, the ones born during the long march and the frantic years of relocation, were the most vulnerable. These were the children who were often sold as bonus items or lots to settle minor debts. They were the children who grew up without ever knowing their mother's last name, if she even had one, or the names of their siblings. In the archives, we see them listed by first name only: Cato, aged 9, Phoebe, aged 7. They were survivors of a system that tried to turn them into orphans while their mother was still breathing in the next county. The youngest, the 5th child, the one who was left in the nursery when the mother went silent, faced a different kind of horror. She would have grown up in the shadow of the Civil War. By 1863, she would have been 5 years old, perhaps hearing the distant thunder of Union cannons or the frantic whispers of the older folks about the Jubilee. But even emancipation didn't mean reunification. When the war ended and the Great Migration began, thousands of formerly enslaved people took to the roads. They weren't just looking for work. They were looking for each other. This period saw the rise of information wanted advertisements in black newspapers like the Christian Recorder. These ads are some of the most heartbreaking documents in American history. They read like a desperate map of the domestic slave trade. I am looking for my mother, who was sold from Virginia to Georgia in 1845. She was a tall woman. She had a son named John and a daughter named Mary. I haven't seen her in 20 years. For the children of the woman in our ledger, the search was almost certainly a dead end. How do you find a mother whose name was never recorded? How do you find a brother who was sold to a man whose name you can't remember? The generational ripple effect of these separations is still felt today. It is a genealogical severed limb. While many Americans can trace their ancestry back to European villages or Mayflower manifests, the descendants of this woman hit a brick wall of ledgers and price tags, but they carried her with them anyway. They carried her resilience in their DNA. They carried the shape of her face and the strength of her hands. The invisible scars of the slave trade are not just psychological, they are structural. The wealth that her 5 pregnancies created for others became the foundation of white generational wealth, university endowments, banking dynasties, and sprawling family estates. Meanwhile, her children began their lives of freedom with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a memory of a woman who was sold while pregnant. Their story is the story of the American family, reconfigured by violence, held together by hope, and defined by a search that never truly ends. Even if they never found her, even if they never saw her face again, they were her legacy. They were the living proof that she was more than a 2-for-1 investment. She was a mother, and they were her children, and no bill of sale could ever truly sever the cord that bound them together. History is not a neutral record of the past. It is a curated collection of what the powerful chose to save. When we look at the history of the American South, we often see a grand narrative of generals, politicians, and the great men who fought over the legality of human bondage. We see the text of the Emancipation Proclamation and the maps of the Underground Railroad, but the story of the woman in the ledger was never meant to be a part of that history. Her story was meant to be buried under the weight of 1,000,000 receipts. Why was she erased? Because her existence was a contradiction that the American myth could not resolve. To acknowledge her as a human being, as a mother who felt the weight of 5 different lives and the grief of 5 different sales, would be to acknowledge that the economic foundation of the United States was built on a crime against the very concept of family. It was easier to turn her into a number. It was more profitable to treat her as reproducible capital than as a soul. For centuries, our history books focused on the theater of slavery, the rebellions, the laws, the grand escapes. We were taught to look for the spectacular, but the true horror of the system lay in its normalcy. It was in the quiet scratching of a pen in a plantation book. It was in the routine appraisal of a pregnant woman. The suffering of enslaved women was normalized because it was the grease that kept the wheels of the economy turning. If the records had reflected her trauma, they would have also reflected the immorality of the men who wrote them. And so, the archive became a filter, catching the prices and the weights, but letting the humanity slip through. To reconstruct a life like hers is a radical act of historical justice. It is an act of speculative recovery. We have to read the ledgers against the grain. We have to look at a line of cold text and hear the heartbeat underneath it. When we find a woman sold 5 times while pregnant, we are not just finding a statistic. We are finding a testament to endurance. We are finding a woman who walked thousands of miles, who birthed a generation in the middle of a war zone, and who survived as long as her body would allow. She had no monument of stone or bronze. No street is named after her, but she existed. Her existence is proven by the very records that tried to dehumanize her. Those ledgers, intended to track a commodity, unintentionally became the only proof of her life. They betrayed the truth. They showed that the wealth of a nation was extracted from the most intimate spaces of a woman's body. As we close this chapter, we have to ask ourselves, how many others are still waiting to be found? How many millions of stories are currently trapped in the yellowed pages of courthouse basements and attic trunks? The woman we traced across 5 plantations is just one thread in a vast, dark tapestry. Her story reminds us that history is not just about what we remember, it's about what we refuse to forget. She was sold, she was moved, she was used, and she was discarded. But today, we say her name Evan, if we don't know it. We recognize her motherhood. We acknowledge her strength. And we finally look at the ledger not as a record of property, but as a record of a survivor. The archives tried to erase her, but in the end, they became the evidence of her undeniable, haunting existence. In telling this story, I have had to navigate the silence of the archive. As a creator, it is a heavy responsibility to speak for those who were never allowed to speak for themselves. This narration is a reconstruction based on the documented patterns of the domestic slave trade and the specific, fragmented records of women found in plantation inventories. We must be careful not to invent her in a way that makes her a character for our entertainment. She was a real person. The pain she felt was not a metaphor. It was physical and psychological reality. The limits of our reconstruction are the limits of the records themselves. We don't know what she whispered to her children. We don't know the songs she sang to keep her feet moving on the road to Alabama. Telling this story matters now because it forces us to confront the true cost of our history. It invites us to look at the hidden people in every archive, the ones mentioned in the margins, the ones listed in the footnotes. It invites us to question what else history has erased in the name of progress or profit. She is no longer just a line in a ledger. Through our focus, she becomes a mirror, reflecting the darkest parts of our past and the enduring strength of the human spirit. If we listen closely to the silence of the records, we can still hear her. And as long as we tell her story, she can never be fully erased.